Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Alter Your Health podcast. I'm Dr. Susanna Alter. I'm a naturopathic doctor who specializes in whole food plant based nutrition and mind body medicine. And we are continuing on with our plant based nutrition in the life cycle and different phases of the life cycle series. And today's episode is focusing in on nutrition for the postpartum phase, especially for women who are lactating in their postpartum phase of life. Just, having given birth, there are so many nutritional considerations to take into account. And so in today's episode, we're going to be talking all about all of these questions. For example, is plant-based eating appropriate in the postpartum and lactation phase of life? Short answer there is yes. We're going to be talking about why there are actually benefits to eating plant-based in this phase of life. But, what specific nutrients do we need to focus on? How much do we need to eat to make sure that both mom is getting replenished, but that baby is getting everything that he or she needs from mama's milk? Other questions also, for example, how to approach supplementation. So many topics and questions to cover in today's episode. Let's just dive right in, kind of, starting off by addressing this question: is plant-based eating appropriate in this phase of life? And I already told you or gave you the hint of yes, it is. A big question that comes up is, does mother's milk, is it influenced by mom's diet? And yes, certainly it is. However, it's so interesting. Actually, we see in a systematic review that all moms, whether they were non-vegetarian, so, omnivorous, or they were vegetarian, where they're eating eggs and dairy, or vegan mothers, they all actually produce breast milk of comparable nutritional value. So pretty much, the nutritional status of the breast milk of all these moms with different types of diets is pretty similar in the end. And that's because the human body is so smart. It's so miraculous. It knows how to create the ideal food for our babies, right? And what's really interesting that we're going to dive into more deeply in today's discussion is we're going to see which nutrients really do depend on the mother's diet in order to provide a good amount of that nutrient in breast milk for baby, and which nutrients actually aren't really dependent on the mother's diet. And it's surprising to see how many nutrients actually aren't dependent on the mom's diet, and how we will actually, sacrifice our own nutritional status in order to still create this high quality milk for our offspring. So interesting. I will say the one nutrient that does come up in the discussion when comparing vegan breast milk to non-vegan breast milk, we'll just use that terminology because it's easier, is the topic of omega-3 fatty acids. DHA specifically is the omega-3 fatty acid that is studied a lot for infant nutrition because it has been shown to be helpful for neurodevelopment. And interestingly enough, in the systematic review, the vegan breast milk and the non-vegan breast milk actually had comparable DHA levels as well. Now, DHA from an omnivorous diet, we know, mostly comes from fish. From a plant-based diet, the only direct source of DHA is actually from algae. Otherwise, we convert DHA from ALA, which we get from flax or chia. I'm going on a tangent here, but I just wanted to kind of point out that one little distinction that, there's arguments saying that vegan moms don't have as high of levels of DHA in their milk, but actually, when you consider all the science out there in the systematic review, really what the systematic review is that all moms had kind of suboptimal DHA levels in their milk. So we're going to be talking more about that. So let's now just kind of shift gears and talk about, some nutritional considerations for, all moms, regardless of whether we're plant-based or not. And the first question is really, how much do we need to eat? How much more do we need to eat when we are in this postpartum phase, when we're breastfeeding? And it's surprising that we actually need to eat even more than when we were pregnant. The recommendation is that in the first 6 months of breastfeeding, we will to take a step back. It's important to know that in the first 6 months of breastfeeding, it's kind of calculated that the mother actually expends about 500 extra calories every day to produce breast milk. So that, could be translated to we need to eat 500 extra calories every day. But the truth is that when we're pregnant, we actually store quite a bit of extra fat in our bodies for this postpartum period so that we ensure that we have plenty of excess kind of fuel on our body that we can then essentially put towards the process of producing breast milk for our babies. So, because we're holding on to a little bit of excess weight that we gained during pregnancy in this early postpartum phase, the recommendation is that actually newly postpartum women in the first 6 months postpartum actually really need to only eat closer to 300 extra calories, or 330 to be exact, in order to have adequate calorie intake for that breast milk production. Now, of course, my recommendation is always like listen to your body, and we don't need to track calories and count calories, especially right when we've just had a baby, right? But the message is that we need to nourish our bodies more. We need to make sure that we're getting enough in order to have what we need to produce this, perfect fuel for our babies. Also, hydration is so important, but that's kind of a different topic. Then once the mother hits 6 months postpartum, that is when typically, that extra weight that was gained during pregnancy is naturally shed. On average, a woman loses about 4 pounds a month postpartum, and then around 6 months or so, is kind of the weight kind of stabilizes. And so that's when this is so interesting that when we're 6 months postpartum, the recommendation is actually to increase calorie intake to 500 calories every day. So the recommendation is actually to eat more the further we're out postpartum if we're still lactating. And this is because the body is still, sorry, let me take that back. It's 400 extra calories, because if we want to get into the nitty gritty here, we actually see that when women get to about that 6 month postpartum period, milk production does go down a little bit, because at that age, the baby's old enough to introduce solids. So they're getting some amount of their calories from solids. So mom's breast milk production actually goes down around 6 months, but it's still estimated that the mom is expending about 400 additional calories for breast milk production. So, sorry, to clarify, the calorie intake recommendation goes from around 300 extra calories a day to 400 extra calories a day. So hope that is clear, and hope that, the overall message that is getting through in me sharing this is that we just need to make sure we're eating enough, listening to our natural hunger cues, not tracking, not counting calories, not trying to go on some diet. Dieting is definitely not recommended in this fresh postpartum phase. Even if a mom is, worried about not losing that excess baby weight, it's like so important that we focus on nourishment, because in the pregnancy period and when we're breastfeeding, we go through so much of our own nutritional stores in the creation of this baby and the creation of this breast milk. And this is definitely a time in our lives when, if we're not nourishing ourselves, nutritional deficiencies could develop. So important that we nourish ourselves and listen to our appetite and eat when we are hungry, and focus on eating more. But more of what specifically, right? And so now we'll talk a little bit more about specific macronutrients, micronutrients, if there's any specific considerations during this time. And what's really interesting is that, the body knows how to produce breast milk, and breast milk, I would love to learn more about this. Actually, I don't know all the specific science of breast milk and how the body is so wise that it knows how to actually change the nutritional profile as our baby is developing and growing. However, what is interesting is that mom's intake of, carbs, protein, fat actually doesn't greatly impact the macronutrient ratio of the breast milk. So, for example, like moms who are eating a low carb diet, they're not going to have low carb milk. They're still going to have the normal healthy amount of carbohydrates in their milk for their baby, and it's because the body knows how to, like I said, how to create this perfectly formulated milk for our babies. Um, but one thing that does change in the realm of macronutrients when we're looking at fats, it's been shown that women who eat more of the polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fatty acids, so women who eat more unsaturated fat, they actually have more unsaturated fatty acids in their milk versus more saturated fatty acids. And this is particularly important when we're talking about the essential fatty acids, right? DHA, once again, is coming up. And so it has been shown that, women who have a higher dietary source of DHA in their diet have higher DHA levels in their breast milk, which is important for that neurodevelopment for the baby. And this is why it's actually become an official recommendation from the American Academy of Pediatrics to recommend that lactating moms get at least 200 to 300 milligrams of DHA in their diet every day. So what this looks like for any plant-based moms out there is supplementing, because we don't have that direct source of DHA in the diet. If we're relying on flax and chia, we simply just don't know the rate at which our body converts the ALA to DHA. And since this is kind of, a consensus recommendation, between many different nutritional organizations out there, it's not a bad idea to just supplement with the algae oil to get that 200 milligrams of DHA a day. Also, there's been science to show that making sure we have good omega-3 fatty acid status for the mom is really helpful also in preventing postpartum depression and anxiety. So good nourishment for mom as well. Now, if we talk about protein, protein, of course, comes up in every nutritional conversation, but it's also important here. Protein needs, when we're lactating, stay about the same as they do when we're pregnant. So we need a little bit of extra. And that just simply makes sense. When we're in this building phase of life, we've just built a baby, created a baby in our body. You need proteins to create the structure and the body of the baby. So we need more protein when we're pregnant. But also when we're breastfeeding, we're still building that body, still, growing that body. They're just outside of us now. Our babies need the protein in their milk. So yes, we need a little bit of extra protein. And on average, it ends up being about 25 extra grams of protein every day. But interestingly enough, protein intake doesn't impact protein composition in milk. So it's not like higher protein diets are like, yeah, we need enough protein to make sure that essentially mom is staying replete in the proteins that she needs to maintain her structure in her body. But if someone is eating a low protein diet, their milk is not going to be deficient in protein, for example. And if a mom is eating a super high protein diet, it's not going to translate to the milk being super high in protein, right? Our body really regulates the macronutrient ratio for our breast milk for our babies. Okay, so moving on to talking about the micronutrients. And I think this is where it gets even more interesting, because we need more of pretty much all of the micronutrients when we're lactating, with the exception of iron, interestingly enough, and folate. Iron we'll talk a little bit more about. But all of the other nutrients, the recommended daily allowance goes up for all of them when we're lactating. And it makes sense, because, we're essentially every single day losing so much nutrition via the production of our breast milk. So we need to keep that replenished to prevent nutritional deficiencies from forming. What's really interesting is that there are some vitamins and minerals that, when we're talking about breast milk, there's some vitamins and minerals that largely depend on the mother's diet to make sure that we have adequate levels of those vitamins and minerals in the breast milk. And there's other vitamins and minerals that don't depend on mother's intake of these vitamins and minerals at all, because the body is wise in that, if mother's diet is deficient in one of those minerals or vitamins, they will somehow leach it from her body to put it in that milk. So when we talk about the micronutrients that are largely dependent on mother's intake of those nutrients, they are vitamin A, vitamin B1, B2, B3, B6, B12, iodine, vitamin K, and the omega-3 fatty acids like DHA. So those all need to be adequate in the mother's diet in order to provide sufficient levels in their breast milk for the babies. All the other nutrients are not dependent on the mother's diet. So let's talk, there's a few of these here that I'd like to talk more about in depth, because there's the question of, especially in a plant-based diet, do we get enough of these nutrients? Do we need to consider supplementing? And so starting off with vitamin A, because the vitamin A needs they bump up quite a bit when we're lactating, to about 4,300 IU. And in a plant-based diet, when we're eating whole plant foods, there's no need to worry about not getting enough vitamin A, because we get it in our sweet potatoes, we get it in our bell peppers, we get it in any food that is orange and red, and even our green vegetables are rich in vitamin A. And I thought it'd be interesting for me actually to fill out a day of eating in Chronometer to see what my postpartum nutrition has been looking like. And so I actually did this yesterday, and I saw that I ended up receiving 9,200 IU. So the recommended daily allowance is 4,300. I had more than double that amount. So that is all in the form of beta carotene, the plant form of vitamin A. And so our body will actually convert beta carotene into active vitamin A as we need it. And this is a good thing, because beta carotene does not have a high risk of creating toxicity in the body like active vitamin A can. And so vitamin A is actually one of the vitamins that has, very, very strict upper limit not to exceed when we're lactating, because it can actually be toxic if the levels are too high in our breast milk. It can be toxic for our baby. So we never want to exceed more than 10,000 IU of vitamin A. But this specifically, it's important to know this is the active form of vitamin A, retinol, which is only found in animal products like liver and cod liver oil and things like that, or supplements that are, vitamin A. So yes, not high risk of toxicity when we're getting that vitamin A from plant foods. So that's something that I think plant-based eating really has going for it in this lactating phase. We don't have that risk of toxicity. I know there's some ways of eating out there that really promote a lot of liver, and you just have to be cautious that you're not getting too much vitamin A. Okay, so the B vitamins also are so abundant in a plant-based diet, except of course for vitamin B12. So let's talk about vitamin B12. Mothers need to make sure that they're getting enough vitamin B12 in order for there to be enough in their milk for their baby. So it is recommended that lactating women supplement with 250 micrograms a day to ensure adequate levels. And that's just, simple. And I'm sure you all kind of understand that, that with plant-based eating, we simply need to supplement with vitamin B12. Okay, moving on to another. So we covered vitamin A, we covered the B vitamins. Going through this list, vitamin C is also so abundant in a plant-based diet. We, if we're eating whole plant foods and we're eating enough, then we are likely getting enough vitamin C for our lactation recommended daily allowance. And vitamin K also, if we're eating our green leafy vegetables, then we are getting an abundance of vitamin K and likely to meet that RDA for lactating women. Okay, so what about iodine? Iodine is actually one that, we need to talk a little bit more about. And this is, again, we're going through all the nutrients that are largely dependent on mother's intake in order for adequate levels in breast milk. And what's really, really interesting about iodine is that mothers who have low iodine intake, the mammary glands of their breasts will actually concentrate iodine to help pass adequate amounts to the infant. When I learned that, my mind was just blown. It's like, gosh, could the body get any cooler? It's just so intelligent. But ideally, we're not at a place where our mammary glands have to do that. Ideally, we're getting enough iodine for the health of our baby, for that neurodevelopment that iodine is needed for. And of course, in the kind of modern diet, a big source of iodine is iodized salt, table salt. In a plant-based diet, iodine, one of the reasons why iodine deficiency is one of the most common deficiencies worldwide is because, especially for individuals who don't live near a source of seafood or seaweed, if they're more kind of landlocked, the iodine levels in vegetables that just are growing from the soil largely depend on the quality of the soil, and it's not always it's just not other vegetables aren't a reliable source of iodine, is what I'm trying to say. So in a plant-based diet, if we're not eating seafood, really the only one reliable source is seaweed. However, even in the case of seaweed, we don't really know exactly how much iodine is in, a tablespoon of dulse. There's kind of like a large range, right? However, it can be a good source of iodine for mom if she's plant-based. And also, this is where the prenatal can be helpful. I always hesitate a little bit around the discussion of multivitamins and prenatals because there really is this message in whole food plant-based nutrition that if you're eating enough and you're eating whole plant foods, you're probably getting enough. You don't need multivitamins. However, and you heard me say this in last week's episode, in this phase of life where more is generally better, but not in all cases, right? Like not vitamin A. We don't want toxic levels of nutrition, but just the prenatal can be a good assurance policy, making sure that we are getting enough iodine, because most prenatals have about half of the recommended daily allowance of iodine contained in them, kind of assuming that the mom is going to get some additional iodine in her diet through other vegetables or seafood or seaweed. So here, I'll just share an example of what I do. I still take my prenatal vitamin to make sure that I'm getting good amount of iodine. The recommended daily allowance for lactating women is 290. And so if you're getting about half of that in your iodine supplement, and then, 2 or 3 times a week, I eat some seaweed. For me, I feel like that's a good amount of iodine that I'm getting in the week. Okay, let's just talk briefly. I realize I'm already 23 minutes in. So let's just talk briefly about some of the interesting nutrients that actually don't depend on mom's intake of these nutrients. And one of them is calcium, surprisingly enough. So if calcium's insufficient in the mom's diet, calcium will then actually be leached from the mother's bones. So that's so interesting. It's really cool. But of course, we want to make sure that calcium is sufficient because there is some transient bone loss that happens in the postpartum lactation phase for women. However, that generally isn't, doesn't increase the risk of osteoporosis later in life. However, if she's really under eating calcium, if she's getting less than 500 milligrams a day, then that will actually increase risk of osteoporosis later in life. So when I did my chronometer, I looked at what I was eating in terms of calcium. I got 1,100 milligrams of calcium. I was, over recommended daily allowance. And to kind of paint the picture, yesterday, what I ate it ended up being 3,000 calories of food, which sounds like a lot, but you'd be surprised when you're breastfeeding how hungry you are. And I started with a large smoothie bowl. For lunch, I had a large oatmeal bowl. For a snack later that day, I had a couple sweet potatoes and a can of chickpeas. And for dinner, I had probably like 4 cups of kitchery and another sweet potato and a half on the side. And I also started with a starter salad of green leafy vegetables and a nut-based dressing. And ended the day with my homemade hot chocolate. So back to, totally whole food plant-based eating. There is not really one processed food that I ate yesterday. Interestingly, I'm not saying I never eat, slightly processed foods, but was able to get 1,100 milligrams of calcium. Crazy. Okay, not crazy. It's just good nutrition, right? Okay, so let's move on to talking about choline, because there's so much talk about choline in terms of choline in breast milk helping with neurodevelopment of babies. And the recommendation that the American Academy of Pediatrics puts out is that the mom should really aim for getting the recommended daily allowance of 450 milligrams. Now, that's actually the RDA for all phases in life. And choline's not really a nutrient that's tracked as commonly as often. It's not in the conversation as much. I just thought it'd be interesting to put out that I also got 450 milligrams of choline in my eating yesterday, even without eating soy, even without eating eggs, which is, touted as the most choline-rich food. So even choline is easy to get when we're eating whole food plant-based, eating enough. Okay, vitamin D. Vitamin D intake from mom's supplementing, right? Because we don't really get vitamin D from our diet. Doesn't influence levels that much. And actually, vitamin D is considered low in breast milk from the get-go. And this is why babies, it's actually recommended that babies who are solely breastfed do supplement with vitamin D. And we're going to talk more about that in next week's episode when we talk about nutrition for infancy. There's some science showing that if moms take higher doses of vitamin D, like 4,000 to 6,000 IUs a day, then it'll increase vitamin D in the breast milk. However, that's technically above the upper tolerable limit for lactating women to take that much vitamin D every day. Now, if you're deficient in vitamin D, that dosage would change and adjust depending on how much vitamin D you need to correct a deficiency. But anyway, the message is that rather than trying to manipulate our breast milk level of vitamin D with supplementation that the mom's taking, it's just the recommendation is to just give the vitamin D directly to the baby. All right, and I'll just wrap up by talking about some of the most kind of common deficiencies that can actually occur in moms in this phase of life. One to look out for is anemia, right? Because there might have been a lot of blood loss during the delivery of the baby. Maybe their iron was already kind of low in the pregnancy phase. And so it's not a bad idea. There's not that much postpartum care in terms of lab follow-up after we deliver, but I would highly recommend that women in the postpartum phase go to their primary care doctor and ask for basic labs to be drawn to look into some of these, obvious things that can happen in the postpartum phase that really impacts how we feel in the postpartum phase. So we'd want to look out for anemia, any iron deficiency, B12 deficiency, and would want to measure ferritin levels. Anemia can definitely contribute to postpartum anxiety, so it's something to look into. And then vitamin D levels also is a nutrient that can commonly be deficient, throughout pregnancy if it wasn't checked before. And we'd want to make sure that those levels are ideally higher than 50 as well, because low levels of vitamin D have been shown also to contribute to postpartum depression. So these are a couple of nutrients to look out for. And as I'm wrapping up here, I just want to kind of remind you of the big points of just this is a time to nourish ourselves. And, for any people out there who are supporting mothers in this phase, really like offer whatever support you can in terms of creating meals for them, making sure that their freezer is stocked full with frozen, meals ahead of time. This is where, one pot meals are really helpful. Slow cooker, instant pot meals are really helpful. Having snacks on hand is really, really helpful. Hydrating enough is really, really helpful. So the message is nourishment, nourishment, nourishment. And the last thing I have to say, because it's so interesting, one major benefit of being a plant-based lactating mom is that it's been shown that the breast milk of plant-based mothers is the lowest in environmental toxicity. This is major, 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 major. Yeah, so I would say if you're interested in this, go do some research, look into the levels, and you'd be amazed at how much lower plant-based, we're called vegan breast milk, is lower in environmental toxicity. I know I probably should have started the conversation with that important topic, but we're wrapping it up with that important topic. So anyway, thanks everyone for sticking with me for another 31 minutes here. And next week we'll be talking about nutrition in early infancy. Can't wait to see you there.